Okay, so we are on part 4 of 4, the last session. And as always, we start with Om. Unmute yourselves, sit erect, adopt Chin Mudra, inhale deeply, and go Om. Feel the vibration in your body. Slow down your thoughts. Just relax. Malika?
Yes. Continue to keep your eyes closed, spine erect, chest and shoulders wide open, facial muscles relaxed, hands in Namaskara Mudra. Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena योपाकरोत्तं प्रवरं मुनीनां पतञ्जलिं प्राञ्जलिरानतोऽस्मि ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. With a few blinks, open your eyes.
Okay, so this is the last session, and today we'll be covering a very exciting chapter called Kaivalya Pada. So, in many of our scriptural texts, some of the Upanishads, like the Katha Upanishad or Mandukya Upanishad, even the Bhagavad Gita, and certainly this chapter, there is a great flight of intellect. And this is one such chapter. It deals with a lot of exciting metaphysical questions. And the first thing that we'll cover from this chapter is the distinction between the original mind and the artificial mind. Next, we will go into desires and how desires are bound by cause and effect. So it will be a discussion on cause and effect. Then we'll discuss where past and future exist. So this is almost like a sci-fi kind of a thing, a movie like Matrix or Inception, that the past, future, and present coexist. And how is that possible? Okay. And then we'll go into what is known in metaphysical philosophy as idealism versus realism. Is the world that we see around us, is it just a projection of a mind, or does it have an independent reality? So we'll discuss that. And before going into Kaivalya, we will discuss how the mind operates and the relationship between consciousness and the mind. So this is what we discussed today. Very, very exciting uh, day. Afternoon it will be. And just before that, in terms of the summary of the last one, do I need to make a summary, or are you guys okay with it? We covered. Sorry.
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Do you want me to summarize what we did yesterday, or you're fine with what happened yesterday? I can proceed.
I think you can proceed, but that's for me. If anyone wants a summary, I think they should ask. I'm fine with you.
You're fine. You're fine.
Yeah.
All right.
Starting with chapter 4. Yeah.
Okay. So since nobody's saying, then I'm assuming that we are fine with it. Okay.
Yeah, proceed, please.
All
Thanks.
right. So about the original mind, there is the third shloka in the chapter, which says our actions, good and bad deeds, do not cause transformation of nature. Is good and bad deeds do not open the source of bliss or create the source of bliss within us. They only remove the obstacles, just like a farmer breaks the barriers to the course of water, which then runs down by its own nature. So, what does this shloka mean? So, first, he gives the example of how a farmer opens the gate and water courses in. So, the water is already there in the canal and it is not coming into the field because the farmer has created a band, a gate. And the moment the farmer opens the gate, the water flows on its own accord. So, similarly, if you take this example, bliss is already within us. We are bliss. The source of bliss and the flow of bliss is already within us, but it is blocked. It is obstructed by what our mind and ego and senses have created, right? And by removing the blocks, we allow the bliss to flow in. So it is not that our good deeds, or if we change our habits, our good deeds are creating the bliss within us. The bliss already exists. What our sadhana does, what yoga does, is a negative, serves a negative purpose in the sense that it removes the obstacles. And once you remove the obstacles, the bliss which is already there flows in. It's a very beautiful shlok, very nice meaning. Okay. Then Patanjali talks about the artificial mind and the original mind. So he says that artificially created minds proceed from egoism alone. And only the original mind born of meditation is free from desires. All right. So what does he mean by that? I mean, he distinguishes the artificial and the original mind in an extremely interesting discussion. Artificial mind is created by kleshas. Kleshas, if you remember from yesterday, were obstructions which ultimately give us pain, pain bearing obstructions. And they are avidya, asmita or ego, raga, attractions, dvesha, repulsions, and abhinivesha, clinging to life. These are the five afflictions. And these afflictions, and the lead of these, the primary of these is avidya. And these kleshas create the artificial mind. And how do they do that? So these kleshas put us onto the wrong course in the sense that we cannot distinguish the real from the unreal, the non-self from the self, right? And therefore our mind gets conditioned and karma carries it forward from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime. The karma carries it forward. So it is a conditioned mind, it's a cultivated mind. And the hiding behind that is the original mind. The original mind is completely unconditioned, it is pure, it is just pure awareness or consciousness. But the conditioned mind is blocking the original mind. And the entire effort of yoga is to come to the original mind slowly and slowly by dropping the artificial mind. The artificial mind is created from egoism, and the original mind is born of yoga, meditation. By meditation, you calm down the mind, you drop the artificial mind, and the original mind shows through. It The original mind can also be called the no mind, because then the mind as we know it does not exist. There are no thoughts, doesn't exist. What exists is just pure awareness. So that pure awareness can also be called the no mind. What he's referring to as original mind, we can also refer to it as the no mind. Now, how to free the original mind, it poses a great paradox in religions. So the question arises, the original mind is a desireless mind. It's got no thoughts, there are no desires. So do we drop desires to attain the original mind? The paradox is that desires are dropped only when the original mind is attained. And then how can desires be dropped without attaining it? So it's a paradox. And some religions condition us to suppress desires. And we saw that suppressing desires don't work. They send us on a guilt trip with anything that is enjoyable in life. Sex is wrong, fun is wrong, happiness is wrong, And the guilt, fear, shame, suppression is definitely not the way to free the psyche and attain the original mind. It kind of eats up our energy and puts us into a state of conflict. And that is why the religions who prescribe this kind of a thing are being questioned now. Okay. On the reverse, there is another religious thought which says this whole world is illusion, and therefore don't bother about the world, just detach from it. Well, even that doesn't work because it ends up creating a mental conflict, and it damages the delicate psyche. You're seeing the world, but you are telling your mind don't participate in the world. So it is again another thought and another vritti which is happening. Okay. And on the third side, there's science, which is deals only with matter and says there is no consciousness. Matter itself at a certain level of complexity becomes consciousness. So, which ensures that we are lost in the sea of frustration, dukkha, suffering forever. Okay. What does Patanjali say? He says that firstly, it is pointless to suppress desires because what we resist persists. So there's no point fighting with desires. We saw that yesterday also. Once a desire arises, it will go to its logical conclusion. There's no point fighting it because it's a losing battle. Okay. Second, about world being illusory, Patanjali disagrees. Yoga disagrees. It says that if consciousness is real, then how can its creation not be real? That's what it says. So they're both real. Now, I don't want to get into great detail of this. There's a different quality of realism to creation and different quality of realism to consciousness. But according to yoga, both are real. If consciousness is real, then what consciousness creates or projects is also real. Okay. So both consciousness, that is intelligence, and matter energy are real. And that is why yoga works with the body, works with your vital energy, works with the mind to increase awareness. So it uses the body's mechanisms to reach a level of awareness which is samadhi. Okay. And as we align more and more with awareness, our ego drops, the operation of the mind drops, and desires automatically fall away. So Patanjali resolves this paradox about do we drop desires to become to gain the original mind, and but if we don't gain the original mind, then how can we, without getting the original mind, how can we drop desires? So he resolves the paradox by saying that the state of desirelessness and the state of original mind are two words to describe the same thing. Desirelessness is equal to the original mind. Okay. What does yoga do? It strips the layers of the cultivated or the artificial mind by freeing us from our past. Thoughts cannot exist past because it's only because of past that there are thoughts. If there are no past, there will be no thoughts, because the present moment is a moment of complete stillness. There can be no thoughts in the present moment. If your past was completely wiped out, there you would have no thoughts. And without thoughts, there is no desire. It's thoughts that lead to desire. You first think about something, and then that leads to the next step of that is desire. And what does yoga do? Yoga, dhyana, what it does, it expands the present moment. And the original mind is then free from the past, and desires cannot exist without the past. So, hence, the sutra says the mind born of meditation is free from desire. It is anasayam. It has no motive, it exists in itself. It is the whole with nothing outside it, and therefore no support is needed and nothing is required from outside. Now we'll go into desire. So Patanjali is saying two things over here. One, he's saying is that desire for happiness being eternal, desires are without beginning. And he says the desires are bound by cause and effect, and desires disappear by disappearance into the cause. What it means is you cannot fight desire at the level of its effect. You have to resolve it into the cause to destroy the desire. Number one. And number two, he's saying is desire is without beginning. So what are these two things? So as we saw that desires arise from kleshas. It is your avidya, egoism, attraction, repulsion, clinging to life, the desire to hold on to life. These are what create desires. And over lifetimes, karma carry them forward. Now, how are desires? So what's the process of creating the desire? So if you do, say, a good act, then there is a desire will arise to do more good acts. And if you do impure act, then desire will arise to do more impure acts, because whatever you do creates a habit, and over time habit becomes a tendency. Now these tendencies uh, make an impression in the mind, as very fine impression in the mind, right? It's called samskaras. And you carry samskaras from lifetime to lifetime. So we are all carrying some samskaras which from previous lifetimes. Okay. And these samskaras are like seeds. And whenever the circumstances are right, the seed will sprout. Now, this creates a very complex problem, because this cause and effect goes on and on and on, lifetime after lifetime. And desire has no beginning, because the desire to live is eternal. So this creation has always been there. The creation comes because of a cosmic desire, right? The creation comes. And since creation is eternal, desire also has no beginning. Yoga, we saw, does not believe in a historical creation. It posits that it has always been there. Vedanta also says it's always been there. So, in fact, all Indian thought says creation has always been there. Okay. Now, since desire is behind creation and creation is without beginning, desire too is without beginning. And the other thing to note is that if a desire comes up from its unmanifest state, it comes up because of the right circumstances, it will flow as effect till it is fulfilled. So it will create circumstances for action till it is fulfilled. That cannot be stopped. And that is why Patanjali reiterates the futility of fighting desires. He says that the causes of all the millions upon millions of desires are the kleshas, and avidya is the primal cause. And the antidote to avidya is pure awareness. In Indian thought, religious thought, there are two types of vidya. One is paravidya and one is aparavidya. Aparavidya is knowledge of the world. What science, what we learn from science is aparavidya. But pure awareness is paravidya, the knowledge of Brahman, the knowledge of Purusha. That is paravidya. So it is like avidya is like darkness, and the the when you get into pure awareness, you like a light a candle in the darkness. So that is paravidya. So antidote to avidya is paravidya. And once this paravidya comes, then all the desires are resolved in the primal cause. The primal cause of desires is avidya. When paravidya comes, avidya is gone, and with it all the desires are gone. So the main point over here is you don't fight desires. It is a losing battle, right? It's absolutely a losing battle. You have to resolve the desires into by looking at avidya, by dealing with avidya. Okay. Now, how does a yogi do this? So for the yogi, the desire can end by simply witnessing without getting involved in his thoughts and feelings, and he lets the river of desire flow. And when that river runs out of momentum, it will stop on its own. Okay. There's no point for him to push the river. The river is as it is flowing. Okay. He doesn't have to get involved in his thoughts and his desires. He just watches and he lets the river flow. And once the momentum is over, the river will stop. If he gets involved in the effects, then fresh stimulus is received and more desires are created. And therefore, you are creating karmas for yourself for the future agami karmas. And only by getting rid of the cause, only by getting rid of avidya, through witnessing, can the effect vanish. And once the yogi withdraws from the courses the desires are taking and just witnesses without getting involved, a lot of energy is released. The energy which would normally gone in, getting involved with your desires is freed, and that gets redirected into spiritual awakening. The third very interesting discussion is where do past and future exist? This is a very, very interesting discussion. So the shloka says that past and future exist in the present, but they're not experienced because they're in different planes. So we can only experience the present, but not the past and the future because they're in different planes. And whether manifest or unmanifest, the past, present, and future are of the nature of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And though there are three gunas, their changes are so, we saw that they act as an organic whole. So they are so coordinated that they have a unity. So this is what we will discuss now. So there are two ideas over here. One is the idea of the present moment, the here now, and the idea of the reality of existence. So when you are in pure awareness, there is no chronological time. Pure awareness is above the line of Maya. Below the line of Maya, you have time, space, causation. Time, space, cause, and effect. That is all below the line of Maya. Above the line of Maya is transcendence, it is just pure awareness. And since awareness is all pervasive, it is everywhere, it is infinite. And since it's everywhere, there's nowhere for it to move. So there's no movement in pure awareness, no movement in Purusha. And if there is no movement, then there's no time. What is the idea of time? Time and space are they exist with each other. You cannot separate the two. What is time? Time is when you go from point A, you're in point A now, and you're in point B then or after. So that difference in time when you were in point A to when you reach point B is time. But since uh, pure awareness, there is no movement, there is no time. So here now, and this pure awareness is substratum of all existence. It is existence. So Prakriti or the changing nature rests on the substratum of this pure existence. Prakriti will change, will is there today. Some parts of it are there today, not there tomorrow. There's the constant change happening. But the substratum is pure existence. And here now is all there is. And existence is also all there is. So here there is only existence because there's no non-existence. There's only existence, and in existence, it's only the present moment. Now, if the only thing that exists is existence, non-existent does not exist. And existence is in the present moment. There's no past and future. There's no time in existence. So where can the past and the future exist? It has to exist in existence. Past cannot just fall off just because it's done in below the line of Maya. It cannot fall off existence. It cannot fall off the substratum. It remains in the substratum. And future cannot rise out of non-existence. It has to remain in existence. It's there. So past is there, the future is there. It's only when we are below the line of Maya, where we are in the circle of time, space, cause and effect, can we see a chronological time. But in reality, Purusha is the sole reality. The existence is a substratum, and therefore everything that exists is in the substratum. The past and the future exist together in the substratum. Okay, now what about the gunas? So the past has already happened and it cannot change. There is stability. So it has a preponderance of sattva guna. The present is dynamic. So it has a preponderance of rajas. While future has not happened yet, it's inert. So it's got a preponderance of tamas. But gunas work in a dynamic balance. They are an organic whole. The example some commentators have given is that of a lantern. There's a oil, there's a wick, and there's fire. But these three together are in a unity which is called the lantern. So the past, present, and future are all involved in the moment. But just like oil, wick, and fire, they exist at different planes. So the present is like the fire, and when you are in your fire, you cannot experience the wick and the oil, but the oil, wick, and the fire, they exist together. The first two are in a different plane. Now, with this, sometimes an argument is made out that since the future already exists, isn't the pursuit of knowledge useless because the future will happen in any case? So that is not true, because through awareness, you can destroy the path to the future. You can burn the seeds of the future. That is the whole idea of yoga. Once you burn the seeds, that's to burn the seeds of the future is when you get kaivalya, when you go beyond the raft of the birth and rebirth. Okay. Now, another interesting subject is this realism and idealism. Is the world that we see, is it a projection of the mind, or does it have an independent reality? Patanjali says no, they have a different reality, and he says That is so because the same object is seen in different ways by different minds, and therefore the object is not dependent on one mind. And the object is known or unknown depending on whether the mind is colored by it or not. Now, this also is a very, very interesting discussion. In metaphysics, there is, as I said, there is idealism theory and there is a realism theory. The idealism theory holds that everything is a projection of the mind. There's no objective reality. All reality is subjective. While realism holds, no, there is a objective reality. The thing as it is exists. Buddhists believe in idealism. So what their funda is that they say we are creating every moment, moment by moment by moment. We are creating everything, creating a new, fresh, moment by moment. Now there are objections to this. We'll not go into this, but what is important is to how Patanjali refutes this notion. He says that different mind, the same object is seen, the first shloka on your screen. The object is seen in different ways by different minds. He says the same object is seen differently by different minds, and that proves that the mind and object are of different nature. So he gives the example, the same woman is seen differently by her brother, by her lover, and by an ascetic. The woman is the same, but three different minds, brother, lover, and ascetic, see her in a different way. So, therefore, there are many conceptions of the same object, which is different from the thing in itself. So, in this example, the woman, there's a thing in itself about that woman, but different minds see them differently. So, therefore, the thing in itself is independent of the mind. If everybody saw the same thing, then that would have been different. So he distinguishes, Patanjali distinguishes thing in itself from its many interpretations. So each mind interprets the object based on its own conditioning and its own relationship with that object. So the world exists as it is as well. So the thing in itself also exists as it is. But our artificial minds of conditioning, thoughts, and desires projects an interpretation of that reality. So whenever there's a signal which an object sends to us, our mind, it becomes a screen, and the mind projects its conditioning, its thoughts, its past onto that screen, right? We are incapable of seeing reality as it is. So what we see is our world and not the world as it really is, but the world as it really is has an independent existence. Okay? So what this shloka indicates is that unless the state of the original mind is achieved, we cannot see reality as it is. It's only when we achieve the original mind through samadhi that the reality as it is begins to seep in. Okay? And the people who have, the rishis who have described this, they say they see interconnectedness in all existence and the full existence in every object. So you will see the full existence in that rose petal. The entire existence is throbbing in that rose petal, is what they describe when they talk about the object as it is. Okay. Now, so there's a common misperception that when a yogi achieves nirvana, the world for him disappears. That is not true. The yogi's interpreted world disappears, but not the world of objects. And Jivan Mukta, is a concept of a person who is still alive in his body, but he has achieved liberation. So it's not that he doesn't he is in that state of no mind, but when he is transacting with the world, transacting with others, he can trick the mind. But the mind is totally his slave. It's like a calculator or it's like a computer for the yogi. So he uses the mind in transactions and keeps it back in his pocket, and again is living in the awareness, the light of the awareness. So this is important. I mean, the world doesn't disappear for the yogi. The yogi's interpretation of the world disappears. Now, another very interesting aspect is how the mind operates. So the shlokas here are: the operation of the mind are always known to Purusha on account of his changelessness. This is a deep shloka and I will interpret it. Then the mind is not intelligent. It being object, it is Prakriti. Prakriti, as we know, is not intelligent. So mind is not intelligent. It's not self-luminous. Third is impossible for the mind to know itself and another object at the same time. So mind is incapable of cognizing an object and itself at the same time. Okay. So the materialists, they say, well, how do we get around this? Because mind is cognizing and mind is there, but it's not cognizing itself. So they say that they assume another cognizing mind. Okay, but this shloka says, but if you do that, then there's no end. It goes on ad infinitum, and it will lead to a confusion of memory or a fragmentation of memory with so many minds, right? And the mind acts for the Purusha. So this is the discourse which we'll cover now. So as we saw that all experience is bipolar, there is a inactive witness and there is some activity happening in the area of what is called seen or the Prakriti. Okay. So two things are happening simultaneously. One is a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, desires, which is in a state of constant change. But behind this flux is a witnessing consciousness which is unchanging and fixed. The mind keeps changing, but the consciousness is eternal and unchanging. And that eternal unchanging is a lord of the mind. So Vivekananda interprets this very well. What he says is that this gives you a logical explanation of the separation of the mind and the Purusha. We saw that the purpose of yoga is to realize that Purusha and mind are separate, right? In our non-enlightened experience, it's all collapsed into one. But here's a logical explanation. So he says, mind being nature, being Prakriti, is in a state of flux. So mind, it's in our experience, mind is splitting from one thought to another thought all the time. One vritti, another vritti, another vritti, another vritti, non-stop. Even in deep sleep, there is vritti. Okay. Now, what Vivekananda says, how do you detect motion? So if you're flying in a aeroplane, and not looking out of the window, you will not detect any motion. Now you look out of the window and you see another plane is crossing that plane, and then you can detect the motion. So motion is detected relative to another motion, which is moving at a different velocity, different speed. Okay. Now, if that be the case, then logic will compel us to stop at something which is motionless. So the fastest thing in Prakriti is moving, and you can detect it by comparing the next fastest thing and the next fastest thing to the next fastest thing, and so on and so forth, till you reach a point where you are the slowest thing. And how do you detect slowest motion against something which is not moving? Okay. So that motionless thing, that is the changeless substratum, the Purusha of yoga, and the Brahman of Vedanta. Therefore, Patanjali says that the mind is known by unchangeability of Purusha. Purusha is changeless. Okay. What is the implication of this shloka? I mean, what can we do? How can we develop the separation of the witnessing consciousness and objects? Is by practicing witnessing. If you're going for a walk by yourself, there's nobody with you, we can train ourselves to notice, just quietly notice a tree, the flower, the garden. And when we normally notice that when you normally see a tree, your mind is full of the tree. There's nothing, you can't differentiate a tree and somebody witnessing the tree. There's only the tree. But if you were to just focus on the tree and quieten down your mind, through that alertness, you might be able to detect the the, the watcher of the tree, the watcher within yourself. And that watcher is the existence, your existence. The mind, the next sloka, the mind is not self-luminous, being an object. So there is tremendous power in Prakriti. In yogis, who we didn't do the third chapter, but yogis on the path will gain lots and lots of what we would call supernatural powers. They can levitate, they can become small, they can become invisible, they can hear distant sound. They will be sitting in Bangalore and listening to a sound in Bombay. Okay. And but so all these powers are there in nature, but nature is not self-luminous. It is not intelligent. It is only this awareness, consciousness, Purusha, Brahman. I'm using all these words interchangeably, is the only thing which illuminates, is the only intelligence. It is its power that percolates through all matter. And mind is just a finer form of matter. It is matter, but in a finer state. Okay. It is more sattvic. It is predominantly sattvic. So we saw that the mind perceives its object by modifying itself into the object. What happens is the object sends a signal to the mind through the senses. The mind sends a thought wave. Consciousness lights up the thought wave, and the thought wave reflects on the surface of the mind. The mind being sattvic, fine, it becomes a reflective surface, and the thought wave is reflected by the intelligence of the Purusha. So the mind gets totally colored by the object, and that's how perception take place. Okay, so when it is reflecting an object, the mind cannot reflect itself. So this is what it means. The mind is not self-luminous, being an object, and impossible for the mind to know itself and another object at the same time. So, earlier go back to the modification of the mind. The only way we can know objects is by modifying ourselves to that object. Okay. So what do the materialists say? Materialists say, well, they don't believe in consciousness and all that. So they say, well, maybe one part of the mind is cognizing another part of the mind. So if that be the case, then who's cognizing that part of the mind? Third or fourth, ad infinitum. And if you do that, then you are fragmenting memory. So we'll be like fragmented memory, and right now we are one memory. We'll be totally, completely fragmented memory and won't be able to function. And that's, we know from our, it's self-evident that we are one memory. So this, what materialists and scientists say, that it could be another part of the mind, is not logical, not reasonable. What Patanjali says is that when the mind reflects the Purusha, it becomes conscious. So the mind will project a thought wave, Purusha will light up the thought wave, and that reflects, Purusha reflects on the surface of the mind. That's when the mind becomes conscious. And the mind works for the Lord, which is Purusha. Okay. And the goal of yoga is to discriminate that Purusha is not the mind. Now we come to the last section, which is Kaivalya. So for the discriminating, the perception of mind as Atman ceases, and then bent on discriminating, the mind attains liberation. And one who maintains a constant state of desirelessness enters the state of dharma megha samadhi, cloud of virtues. One who has achieved nirvikalp samadhi, that is, the mind is not there, there's no thought, there's absolutely no thought. He is in that state, that person will be visited by a cloud of virtues. And then follows freedom from kleshas and karmas. And the resolution is in inverse order of qualities, bereft of any motive of action by Purusha, and that is Kaivalya. So we'll just do this section. So, what is Kaivalya? The meaning of Kaivalya is Keval. From the word Keval in Hindi, all of you are aware of. Kaivalya is aloneness. It is the realization that there is no dependence on anything in the universe. That realization that no dependence on anything in the universe is called Kaivalya. Okay. And with this realization, the yogi becomes a witness and doership ceases. Now, with Nirvikalpa Samadhi, there's no mind. The yogi will simply watch. He watches the birds sing, hear the birds sing, he'll watch his veins throb, he'll watch his thoughts moving, he'll watch the farmers protesting. But there is no identification with any of this because there's no mind. There's no mind, and with no mind, there's no ego. Nothing is there. And even as I said, when he uses his instruments to interact in the day-to-day life, also he uses those things as instruments. They're totally in his control and is fully aware of what he is doing. Okay. So there's no identification, there's no I am this body, I am this mind. All the instruments required for identification are gone. And the yogi becomes a pure witness. And in that state, all the desires have disappeared. There's complete desirelessness. And with that, very interestingly, death also disappears. Why is that? In its essence, death exists only because we identify ourselves as individual, unconnected waves. So we had earlier taken the example of the ocean and the wave. So suppose the ocean is a substratum, it is Purusha. Suppose the ocean is like that. And in the depth of the ocean, there's complete stillness, right? But the waves are on the surface of the ocean. But if we identify ourselves as waves, then we will cling on to being waves. We'll be very scared of the waves smashing against the rock and falling into the ocean. So, death is only that we fight this desire to be a wave. In Kaivalya, the yogi sees that the wave and the ocean are not separate and that the ocean is eternal. It's the whole. And he is the whole. He is not a wave, he is the ocean. So, where's the question of death? So, Kaivalya is the ultimate healing. All tensions, all desires, all hopes, frustrations, dreams that identified the yogi with the wave are gone. And Patanjali says that when he becomes aware that he's neither body nor mind, then something happens. Something pulls him up. It's called grace. And liberation is nothing but entering a stream of grace. On his own, the yogi can reach Nirvikalp Samadhi. After that, to burn the seeds of all past karmas and future karmas is the job of grace. There's nothing he can do. He has dropped all the barriers. He has destroyed all the controls. Now, liberation will happen on its own. This is a state of absolute desirelessness. There's not even a desire of moksha because there's no mind to desire anything. And desire of moksha is counterintuitive because moksha means that there is no desire. So how can you desire moksha? You and I can desire moksha, but in that state when there's no mind, there is not even a desire of moksha, because moksha by its very nature is desirelessness. And when that happens, something great happens. People have described it very nicely. There's a shower of virtues. Whatever are the seeds within you, whatever is a mess from past karmas within you are cleansed out by the dharma meg samadhi. Okay, but it's called meg. It's called a cloud because it's not the final state. The yogi still has to go beyond that. This is not the end. But all great rishis have said that as a result of dharma make samadhi, they found all the foundations of knowledge within themselves. They found truth had become real, it had become self evident. Calmness, purity had become their nature. So they describe it as a very, very nice state. And some of them also describe it, it was so pleasurable they didn't want to go beyond that. But their gurus and all have egged them on to go beyond that. After that, what happens? After that, there's nothing to be done. All the tools of action are destroyed. The yogi then just waits. He just watches the river flow, the birds sing, and the bees buzz. And Kaivalya happens on its own. Now, one interesting thing is, why go through this whole rigmarole? If if the reality is of Kaivalya that we are Purusha, why do we go through the ego, mind, all the suffering, dukha, pukha, all that thing? What is the reason for this? So it's like this. There is only Brahman. There's only Brahman. And Brahman has a desire to experience itself. So how does it do that? So it hides in an individual being and forgets that he that he is Brahman. He gets mixed up with Prakriti. And the the job of Prakriti is to make him real, take him through all the experiences, lifetime over lifetime, till he realizes that he's Brahman and that joy of experiencing himself. So it's all a leela. It's all a leela of the ocean. And we suffer because we think that we are the waves. And all suffering is there so that we can find ourselves. Otherwise, there's no meaning. I mean, it's completely pointless, existential. And to those who say the body is illusory, Patanjali says this body made of karma is the only means of attaining nirvana. Only then the burden of carrying the body becomes meaningful. And dwelling on this aspect, Swami Vivekananda pays his obeisance to Mother Nature with unmatched poetic insight. I'll read it. You can also see it on your screen. He says, nature's task is done. This unselfish task which our sweet nurse, nature, had imposed upon herself. She gently took the self forgetting soul by the hand, as it were, and showed him all the experiences in the universe, all manifestations bringing him higher and higher through various bodies, till his lost glory came back and he remembered his own nature. Then the kind mother went back the same way she came, for others who have lost their way in the trackless desert of life. And thus she is working without beginning and without end. And thus, through pleasure and pain, through good and evil, the infinite river of souls is flowing into the ocean of perfection of self realization. What a great man Vivekananda was. This is where Patanjali Yoga Sutra ends. But before I end, I would like to acknowledge where I got this knowledge from. So much of the knowledge has come from Vivekananda himself in his complete works, volume 1. A beautiful book by Kothanda Raman. It's called The Ambrosia of Yoga, a commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. There was a very, very, very renowned Siddhar who lived in Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the 16th or 17th century called Sada Shivendra Saraswati Avaduta. His samadhi is somewhere in Kerala now. So he wrote he was a realized soul. So he wrote a, a book in Tamil called Ambrosia of Yoga, which Kotanda Raman has translated. Then there's a very maverick book, but also brilliant by Osho. It's called The Alpha and the Omega in 10 volumes. He talks about Patanjali Yoga Sutra. It's a fantastic commentary, a little maverick, but very, very insightful. Then, what asanas do, pranayama does, all that I got from Swami Mukti Bodhananda, Hatha Yoga Pratipika. Some knowledge of chakras and nadis, which I talked about, came from Shiva Samhita. Shiva Samhita is author unknown, but that text is available and it was translated by Chandra Vasu. And the knowledge of Samkhya came from Ramakrishna Puligandala, called Fundamentals of Indian Philosophy. So this is it, and you're welcome. If there are any questions, any comments, you can put on your audios if you want.
Atul, after going through these 4 days, I was just trying to relate it to the current, not current this thing, but of the past, the people whom we may know of. So, do you think a Sai Baba of Shirdi and such would be such yogis who have experienced this whole process?
Certainly.
Yeah.
But if you read other, I mean, and just say for just one person, there are many people who are known as avaduts. So avaduts, they have no desire to teach others.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of them, and the real mystics. If you read the autobiography of Sri M,
Mm-hmm.
he talks of some Sufi avadut in the hills of Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he talks about the Himalayan masters. He talks about this lady, Bengali lady in Rameshwaram, who used to roam around naked. She had no consciousness about what is naked, what's not naked, and she wouldn't teach anything. But she was a realized soul. She would just bless people. So this is a very interesting sort of people. So some people have it in them to teach others. Some people just remain as it is. But yes, certainly Shirdi Sai Baba was, from what I can gather, was a realized soul.
Okay.
Anything else on this particular chapter?